Red Baron.
We're not leaving. You ready?
Park one. That was super fun.
What a gig that was, man.
Yeah. You went all out on that one.
That was over the
It
top.
was so hard. I had to make a hybrid chart for myself with the lyrics, but with like hints of what to play as I was playing at the same time. So I was like, how am I going to navigate this fucking song, you know? And the thing that got me through it was I invited Jimmy Webb to come do it with us.
Yeah.
And he was such a big fan of the show. And he played that intro, that harpsichord, ding, 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 ding,
Yeah.
ding.
Both of them.
He hadn't played that since the record with Richard Harris, the original single, in the studio. And he was really nervous.
Yeah.
Fucking nervous. And I found myself going over to him and calming him down. I'm the one that was supposed to be nervous.
Yeah.
But he was so nervous that I forgot about it and calming him down. So he saved my whole shit.
Oh, that's awesome.
Just by being fucked up.
Yeah. You know, it blew my mind when I found out Richard Harris also played Dumbledore in the Harry Potter.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like I had heard, I had seen the two things separately, but you know, I didn't realize it was the same guy.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
amazing actor. He was an amazing drunk. He came on. He's like Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton. And other guys. He's got massive drinkers.
Yeah.
And they used to come over and tell great stories about him and shit. It's like, how did these guys survive? How could you be such badasses and do all that drinking and shit? Somebody slaps a piece of paper on my amp. Big
Afraid to
band,
fall asleep.
big band stuff.
Yeah.
Learning how to read bass and shit. Piece of paper, look at it, says call Randy Brecker 212 something. Randy Brecker, why do I know? Couldn't put it together. I've been listening to Dreams forever.
Yeah.
And I call up and this girl answers, this is Bobby, you know. I said, well, do you know what's going on? She goes, yeah, I think Randy and Dreams want to fly you up to New York to an audition. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Can I be there yesterday, you know?
Yeah.
I couldn't get there fast enough. I was so excited.
That's amazing.
And I walk in to this dingy ass town, and there's a rehearsal place that's down in a basement where you have to go in this elevator and pull a rope to get down to it.
Oh.
This is where everybody rehearses. I'm walking down the hall toward the audition, and I'm passing SIR type cases, anvil cases, Miles Davis, Carlos Santana, you know, fucking Johnny Winter. Where am I? You know?
Yeah.
It's so surreal. And I was like freaking out. And I go in the room and I'm like really nervous and stuff. And then Billy starts to play and lays it down. I didn't have to do anything. It stopped thinking and just started playing. And it was the easiest thing in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I've never played with a drummer like that. where I didn't have to like be the guy keeping making the time happen in the
Yeah.
band. He was just, this is it, motherfuckers. Take it or leave it. Yeah. In that Gary Novak kind of way.
Yeah.
I mean, when he left Dreams, he was irreplaceable. We didn't like anybody.
Yeah.
We didn't even like Gad. I mean, we had 86 drum auditions.
Wow.
We tried to replace him, and he was the guy driving the bus, so nobody would take over in the way that he did it. So we folded.
Wow.
We had gigs, obligations, so we had different cats play it, and just like never the same. Wow. Because he was off to Mahavishnu land.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Mahavishnu was after Dreams?
Yeah. And I was at the Mahavishnu first album, the album release party. It was one block near on Bleecker Street at this little tiny room called the Gaslight Cafe. And I don't know if you guys ever experienced the Mahavishnu thing live. That little room playing at that volume. Just, wow. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I've
wasn't
photographed them several times.
Yeah.
Once at the U of M in the cafeteria, then I guess it was probably the Sportatorium.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wait a minute. Was that
Sportatorium, Mahavishnu.
was that also this Highlight Fronton place? Or was that a different place?
That's in Miami,
I saw
36th
Hendrix
Street.
there. Hendrix and Zeppelin at that place.
Crazy. I saw Zappa there.
At the Sportatorium?
Tom
or
Waits,
at the
no,
Fronton?
at the Fronton. And Cheech and Chong.
I saw Cheech and Chong.
That's funny. Billy was just talking about me.
Dave's
Really?
not here. Dave's
Yes.
not here, man.